When it came to defining government's proper sphere, Coolidge was a minimalist, not a nihilist. There's a difference. In his first message to Congress in December 1923, for example, he advocated federal anti-lynching legislation, endorsed a minimum wage for female workers, and urged a constitutional amendment to prohibit child labor. This is also vintage Coolidge. Nothing is easier than spending the public money. It does not appear to belong to anybody. It will come as no surprise that Calvin Coolidge, in and out of office, made a career out of being underestimated. In some ways, he still is. Certainly, the portrait enshrined in textbook history bears scant resemblance to the most popular American political figure between the two Roosevelts. The unlikely radio star and diligent administrator who worked longer hours than Woodrow Wilson had before the war, who entertained more White House guests than Theodore Roosevelt, who conducted more frequent, if less revealing, press conferences than FDR. Hardly a great communicator in the modern sense, Coolidge seized upon radio to compensate for his lack of charisma. In his own words, "I can't make an engaging, rousing, or oratorical speech to a crowd, as you can," he told a fellow Politico. "All I can do is stand up and talk to them in a matter-of-fact way about the issues of the campaign." Radio equalized everything. It was the perfect medium for someone like Coolidge, who was understated in his oratory and his oratorical claims. The recently opened papers of White House Dr. Joel Boone explode the myth of a do-nothing president who swept away his term. They reveal just how great a toll the presidency claimed from Coolidge, who never recovered from the 1924 death of his namesake's son. "The ways of Providence are often beyond our understanding," wrote the grieving father. "I do not know why such a price was exacted for occupying the White House." In the days following young Cal's death, the president instructed the head of his Secret Service detail never to turn away any boy who wanted to see him. To one White House visitor, he remarked, "When I look out that window, I always see my boy playing tennis on that court out there." That he blamed himself for the loss of his son is more than sufficient explanation for the emotional depression that shadowed Coolidge's years in office. Of course, it was another depression following hard on the heels of his departure from Washington in March 1929, which has led historians to arraign him for his alleged failure to anticipate or avert economic disaster. They misread the Yankee fatalist who wrote to his father on New Year's Day 1926, "I suppose I am the most powerful man in the world, but great power does not mean much except great limitations. I cannot have any freedom to come and go. I am only in the clutch of forces that are greater than I am." And then a true cry from the heart, "Thousands are waiting to shake my hand today." It sounds like a bromide, but the fact of the matter is history is the most organic of disciplines. It grows out, literally, of the past. To fault Coolidge's generation for failing to grasp and implement Keynesian economics is akin to criticizing prehistoric man for his ignorance of fire, or Civil War doctors for lacking penicillin. Imagine, for a moment, an America, a very different America, in which few citizens look to the man in the White House to feel their pain or solve their problems. If you were Coolidge's age in 1923, you would have been through a roller coaster, a tumultuous, I mean, in some ways, I suppose, not terribly dissimilar to what today's generation, if you look beginning with the Kennedy assassination and Vietnam and the credibility gap and the assassinations of '68 and Watergate and a president leaving office and the end of the Cold War, on and on and on, this sense that history had accelerated. That we were all on a treadmill going ever faster and faster and trying to keep up with events beyond our control. Well, that's not unique to our world. If you go back to the 1920s, say you were Coolidge's age, think of what you would have experienced in a single tumultuous generation. You would have seen the assassination of a very popular president named William McKinley, coming hard on the heels of America's first foreign war, as we grappled with the whole notion of imperialism and Republican empire. Then McKinley is assassinated. He's replaced by Teddy Roosevelt, who reinvents, in many ways, not only the presidency, but in some ways the nation in a few short years, who certainly reinvents the Republican Party and then splits it down the middle, the nation's governing party, in 1912 because he's not happy with William Howard Taft's performance. Then you see Woodrow Wilson, the first Democratic president in a generation, and only the second in more than 50 years. He takes office on a platform of domestic reform, the New Freedom, only to become a wartime president who's consumed by regimentation, domestic turmoil, and shameful outbreaks of racial and ethnic intolerance. Between 1916 and 1920, 4 years, tax revenues multiplied sixfold. During the same period, the national debt went from $1 billion in the aggregate to $26 billion. Wartime inflation sent the cost of living skyrocketing. Factor in the post-war wave of strikes, red baiting, and official repression, and it is small wonder that voters in 1920, desperate for a return to the way things used to be, should embrace what Warren Harding memorably, if ungrammatically, called normalcy. There was a sense that people had been exposed to too much history, too much change. And unfortunately, of course, they were disillusioned by Harding and his boozy Ohio gang, who looted the public treasury and tarnished what remained of wartime idealism. All of this had happened in the space of about 20 years. That's the backdrop for Coolidge. When Coolidge was unexpectedly nominated for vice president in 1920 to run with Harding, a reporter from Massachusetts who knew him offered to bet his colleagues at dinner that Warren Harding would die in office, thereby enabling the famously lucky Coolidge to succeed to the presidency. Others were even more contemptuous of the closed-mouthed Yankee. In the words of one Democratic observer that year, Coolidge was distinguishable from the furniture only when he moved. Well, but there's another side to Coolidge. Coolidge is a Yankee, he is a fatalist, he's a Puritan. William Allen White got a lot of things wrong in his biography of Coolidge, which is a delightful read, but bears almost no resemblance to reality. But when he called him a Puritan in Babylon, that was a stroke of genius. Coolidge said, "Things are so ordered in the world that those who violate its law cannot escape the penalty. Nature is inexorable. If men do not follow the truth, they cannot live." Nothing in his subsequent behavior was so revealing as Coolidge's conduct on that sultry night in August 1923, when Warren Harding died in a San Francisco hotel room, and the new president was sworn into office by his 72-year-old father, a Vermont notary public. The lamplit inaugural, conducted in a front parlor 17 by 14 feet, in a house bereft of electricity and without indoor plumbing, struck a powerful chord among Americans who had no intention of practicing such rustic self-denial in their own lives, but who took vicarious comfort from having a president who did. The 1920s are a time when men and women moved forward, often while looking back. In this, at least, Coolidge was at one with his countrymen. Before setting out for Washington on the morning of August 3rd, the new president stopped at the Hillside Cemetery in Plymouth Notch, where 5 generations of his family lay buried. He paused before the grave of his mother, whose life had ended prematurely when Calvin was a boy of 12. Hers was to be the first picture he placed on his White House desk, a likeness he would carry with him until the day of his own death.